Okay, y'all, so welcome. My name is Brian Sternidi. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager with the Dutchess Land Conservancy. Thanks for joining us for our second webinar in this year's Earth Matters series. We have a great time hosting these events, so we're so happy you can all be here with us tonight. Tonight, we're very excited to welcome Don Smith as he gives his presentation. The answer is soil. But first, let's go over some basic information about tonight's webinar, followed by a brief introduction to the Dutchess Land Conservancy, this program, and tonight's presenter. First off, you're muted to ensure there's no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled. Please enter all questions into the Q&A box at any point during the presentation, and you can find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. They'll be addressed when the presentation is done or by us if we can during the presentation. And if there's a large amount of questions, we might try to combine them based on topics. Third, chat is disabled for this event, again, so that there's no interruption. Fourth, closed captioning is enabled for this event. Just locate the closed caption button on the bottom of your screen. And then finally, I'm going to hand it over to Julie Hart, our Education Director, who will tell you a bit about the Dutchess Land Conservancy, this webinar series, and our guest presenter, Julie.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Julie Hart, an ecologist and educator here at the Dutchess Land Conservancy. Many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who's not, let me just give you a quick overview. The Dutchess Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we're dedicated to preserving the farms, forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces, and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we have worked with hundreds of landowners and protected almost 46,000 acres of land. Many thanks to the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund for sponsoring this event tonight. We're so excited about our new season of Earth Matters, the DLC's winter webinar series. We'll be bringing you interesting speakers on the first Tuesday of each month through April. And this season, we are digging into the topic of soil health. We'll be learning about soil food webs, regenerative soil management practices, composting, and the ecology of soil health. Our theme is very simple. Soil is not dirt. And the timing of tonight's presentation could not be more perfect, as I'm sure you all know that yesterday was World Soil Day. So I don't know about you, but I had a great day celebrating the wonders of soils by posting some fun stuff on Instagram. So let's get started. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Don Smith, a stewardship program advisor and teacher from Kiss the Ground, as our speaker. Kiss the Ground is a wonderful organization whose mission is to awaken people to the possibilities of regeneration and inspire participation in this movement through media, communications, education, workshops, immersive programming, and advocacy. Don is a speaker, teacher, and student of regenerative agriculture and regenerative lifestyles. He applies his lifelong knowledge, advising Kiss the Ground, teaching and supporting course development for various Kiss the Ground education initiatives, including the Soil Advocate Training Course, all of which promote hands-on, viable solutions to the world's largest problems. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Don, and you're going to explain to us why the answer is soil.
All right. Thank you, Julie, for that great introduction. So this introductory slide was just so you guys had something to look at while we were getting started. But really, awe and gratitude, it's something that I try and remind myself every day to have more of. Because every one of these life forms, in fact, in each picture, you might just be focused on one life form, but there's typically lots of other life forms in there. And they're all doing amazing stuff, and they've been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. And we just blissfully don't pay much attention to them. So when you get a chance, admire it, whatever it is. It's a wonderful thing. And here we go. So Kiss the Ground. What the heck is Kiss the Ground? Well, I got to go back to my humble beginnings. The farmer's market, right? Beware the farmer's market. You never know what might happen. And this is what took me down a rabbit hole. Innocently, I went to the farmer's market because I heard the food tasted great. It did, but I noticed that some farmers' strawberries or tomatoes tasted better than other farmers' strawberries and tomatoes. And that made me curious. Why? Was it different soil? Was it different management, et cetera? And I kind of went down the rabbit hole at the farmer's market and just started asking questions. I started visiting farmers. I started asking how they took care of their land. And it led me down this path of soil and soil health. And it was really, really astounding. So I kept studying that more and more and more, and got interested in fungi as well. And just the world of soil is so amazing. So this organization, it wasn't even called Kiss the Ground yet, but I got a phone call from a friend of mine who happened to be at a bar, and I get a call from a bar and he says, "Hey, Don, would you be interested in talking to a group of people in Venice, California about soil and compost? They'll pay you." And I was like, sure, I do that all the time for free, so why not? So I go show up at a living room in Venice, California. There's a bunch of young hipsters there. And I do my presentation. After 2 hours of talking about soil health and compost, they were like giddy, like, "Oh my God, this is so amazing." And I still didn't really know who they were. So I asked them, like, "Who are you? Why are you guys so fired up?" And they're like, "Well, we heard about soil as a solution to climate change, and we're going to do something about it. We know influencers and people with money, and we're in the film capital of the world. We're going to make a movie about it." And I was like, wow, I've never met people so fired up. Can I be part of this group? And they said, sure. So it took a little while, but after 7 years from starting out with nothing and just an idea in the living room in Venice, California, out came a movie called Kiss the Ground. I'm guessing that some of you have watched it. Probably a majority of you might have watched this. If you haven't, it's still on Netflix. It's got over 10 million views. One of the most popular documentaries out there, especially for ones that talk about soil, because that's not really that exciting a subject. So our mission is awakening people to the possibility of regeneration. It's kind of a different concept because we don't really think too much about regeneration. We just hear about humans and degradation. Everything we do, we make worse, basically. So we've got this huge problem, right? 50% of the land and ag soils heavily degraded, like heavily. And it's not just in the US. I mean, it's a global issue. It's huge. And it's impacting climate, water, our own health, food and national security, immigration issues. All these things are huge problems. And soil is going to address them all. So most of our land management is literally destroying soil. And I'm showing you a picture of a plow or tillage, but that's not the only thing, right? We've got overgrazing, we've got all kinds of different things that we do in ag that are hampering the process of building soil, and it's causing this massive degradation. Currently in the US, we're still losing, and this number you can debate it all you want, at least 4 tons of topsoil per acre per year. And it's not just from water causing the erosion, right? It's also a large part due to wind erosion. And it's crazy, doesn't sound like, oh, well, that can't be that much. It's only 4 tons an acre per year, but that adds up. Our biggest export, according to some people, is topsoil. That's not a good thing. We do not want to be doing that. But it's not a new thing, right? Soil loss has been going on since since we started agriculture. So it depends on how you want to look at that, whether it's 7,000 years or 10,000 years, doesn't really matter. It's a long time. And we've been degrading the environment for a really long time. Back when FDR was around, a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. Okay, well, if he was saying that back then, he created, before the NRCS, the Soil Conservation Society. All of that has been going on since then. And now we're still losing 4 tons per acre. It's not really working. The Fertile Crescent, it used to be fertile. And I know some of you are probably on the East Coast, but California, this is pretty common in California. This area, which is the Central Valley of California, used to be with the water table basically at the surface, right? There were 3 large lakes and they were connected by other waterways. And it was one of the most fertile areas in the world. It doesn't look that way now, right? So we've lost a third of our farmable land in just the last 40 years. It's happening everywhere. Pick a continent, there isn't one that is not happening. And that would lead to believe we're doomed and I can't do anything about it, right? So that's where, okay, doom and gloom's over. The good news, right? We can regenerate land. This picture happens to be from the Lorax Plateau. This is John Liu's work. Well, it's not his work, but he documented the whole thing. Fascinating story. This is an area the size of Belgium. It's not a small area. This is big. And it was the most degraded soil, the fastest eroding soil that I read about in National Geographic. And China did something about it. They put in a bunch of money, a bunch of thought, and figured out how to change something. But they used the local people to do it. Local people were given rights to the land, et cetera, and taught what to do and what not to do. Because basically, they clear cut it, they overgrazed it, and it eroded at rapid pace. So we can fix that. So our solution to all these huge problems is regenerative agriculture. Does it have to look like this? No, this is just one example of someone, and this is called a roller crimper, and they're literally terminating this crop that you see there, and the crimping on that is cutting the stalks in multiple spots, and then that is going to lay down onto the soil surface and provide an armor for the soil. So there's lots of different principles involved in regenerative agriculture. This is just one example, but it can address all these major issues that we have here. So once again, this perspective that we're looking at, you've got a really bad situation. If you look at where we are, right, the red dot, we are here. We've been degenerating for a really long time, and we don't even know how bad it is because most of us weren't around when things were going really well. So we're slow to notice that we're way down here. So our response to degeneration has really been, well, let's not make it any worse. We'll sustain it, right? We come up with sustainability as the fix. But sustainability is really missing the mark. It's setting the bar way too low. First, we need to talk about regeneration. And that's a foreign concept because we didn't think humans could regenerate, right? We're really good at degenerating, but not many of us know about regeneration. I just want to point out on the left side where it says landscape function and carrying capacity. So if a landscape is able to have less biodiversity, store less water, provide less nutrients, et cetera, that's degenerative, right? We're talking about the reverse of that. We're talking about making it better over time. And we can do that when we work with nature. And then we can talk about sustainability. So we put sustainability ahead of its time. We really need to focus first on regeneration and then focus on sustainability.
Hey, Don, can I break in for 1 second, please?
Yes.
Would you mind potentially closing your PowerPoint and or actually just stop sharing and resharing again? I think there's an issue where some of your first slide is still showing up as the presentation rolls along. And it's probably a Zoom thing.
That is a Zoom thing. Okay, thanks. Let me see here.
Sorry to break your stride.
No, that's okay. Does that look correct?
That looks a million times better. I appreciate it.
Okay. Was anything cut off before, or was it?
No, but now, yeah, it seems to leave a little bit of an artifact of the first slide you start on. Can you advance back again just for 1 second? Yeah, it's just leaving a little bit of it. It might not be much we can do about it.
Wow, that's a new, I haven't had that experience before, so.
Yeah, same. Might just be an artifact of what we have, but we can still see a good percentage of the slides. So we can still see about, I'd say 92% of the slides. So we're good.
Is it the top part, the bottom part?
There's a small wedge at the top part, top center, and then there's a small wedge at the bottom right.
Okay, well, all right. I don't know how to resolve that one. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's probably without restarting the webinar. I think that's what we're going to live with. But
Okay.
honestly, we can see most of the presentation.
Okay. All right. Technical difficulties.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks,
So
Don.
here's another picture here, right? So this landscape obviously is not looking too fertile. And, why do we want to sustain that? It's not a good idea. So basically, we have a theory of change, and you have to have a new view, and then you're going to take a different action, and that's going to give you a different result. So that's kind of how change happens. And then in order to get to the next level, which is a movement, right? First, you have to create that awareness so that collectively people take new actions, and then we get new outcomes. And that's really what we're focusing on with regenerative ag, is getting people to understand this concept of regeneration and literally building this movement. And it's both from, it's called grassroots, but it's also called grass tips, right? You've got to talk to the people at the very top, but you've also got to get all the people beneath you too. And this movement luckily is growing, but in order for it to really grow, we have to get people to understand the basics. So Einstein said it really well. If I can remember what he said, look deep into nature and you will understand everything better. So he didn't just say, look into nature. He said, look deep into it. And he didn't just say, you'll understand some stuff better. He said everything, right? So really, really smart. So first, what is soil, right? And if you understand these basics, right? We know it's sand, silt, and clay, air, water, and some soil organic matter, right? That's super basic. And I'll go into these in a little bit more detail, but just think about that. A lot of the soil is air. That's really important. The other part is water. That's really important. We're looking at 50% of soil being air and water, both key components. Sand, silt, and clay, you might say, well, that's kind of boring stuff. It's just different sized particles, but those particles contain minerals, right? They're not necessarily in plant available form, but they're in there. And in order for them to get out of there, it requires a whole bunch of microbes. And that's where the organic matter comes in, because as you learned last week, the living organisms in the soil are really critical. So all those little critters, and organic matter is everything that was living, dead, once alive, etc. All that stuff is really important. And then we want to have as much as possible because it makes a big difference in the component. So if we have, I just want to show you this real quick. If it's different amounts, like look at this one, it's only got 1% soil organic matter. It's compacted, right? So when you look at it, 74% of it, and these are just hypothetical numbers, but the majority of it is sand, silt, and clay. A much greater portion is sand, silt, and clay. It doesn't have nearly as much air. It doesn't have as much water. And then on the other side, when you have this properly aggregated soil, right? You've got the sand, silt, and clay glued together. I'll talk about aggregation in a little bit. It makes a big difference because you get bigger pore spaces in between where air can come in. That's where you get your gas exchange, right? Air is, what is it? Mostly nitrogen, right? So we've got this 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. All that nitrogen can get into our soil, and that's a very important process. When you have poor gas exchange, can't happen. Bigger pore space means it can infiltrate more water, really critical. We need water to be stored in our soil. We want our soil to act like a sponge, so we need that good aggregation. And so we've got a much smaller percentage of sand, silt, and clay. It's still there, right? You need the sand, silt, and clay, but this one has 10% soil organic matter. It's huge difference. But that soil organic matter changes the structure of soil. And that's where aggregation is so key to this whole process. So if you think of soil, this is a kind of an analogy. If you think of a giant apartment complex, like let's say the soil aggregate on the right is a giant apartment building, right? It's got filled with rooms and hallways and elevator shafts and air conditioning ducts and internet wiring, all that stuff. On the left side, that whole building collapsed, right? So all those bricks are stacked on top of each other. the whole structure, all the plumbing, all the wiring, it's all just one mess. It's all broken. There's no air spaces, there's no water infiltration, etc. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about soil that's not aggregated, right? It's like a broken building. It's dysfunctional. So we want to get away from dysfunctional soil and back to functional soil. And in order to do that, we need to increase our soil organic matter. Most of our soils in agricultural land are now down somewhere around 1% soil organic matter. And if you think, well, that's not that bad, it's not zero, it's really hard to get below 1 because some of that organic matter just won't oxidize. It won't break down any further. So it's always going to be there. So we've pretty much done as much damage as we could do. So understanding where organic matter came from, you have to sort of get this picture. Where does a tree come from? And normally if I was able to ask my audience, I'd ask you guys, where does a tree come from? And some people would say the soil, you silly person, but really it's coming from the air. It's the carbon in the air that actually builds the tree. It's not carbon from the soil. So plants are built from thin air, plants and trees, right? They're sucking in that carbon dioxide, and we like to call it photosynthesis because it's such an amazing process, and it was really poorly understood. We understood that it helped build the plants, but what we missed out was this whole part about what it did afterwards. So on the underside of leaves, the majority of stomata are on the underside of leaves. And I also like to ask that question as well. Why do you think most of them are on the underside and not the top side of the leaves? Anyway, there's approximately 300 per square millimeter, and they're in there, little CO2 monsters, right? Cute picture. They're in there absorbing carbon dioxide. The reason that they might be, this is a hypothesis, on the underside of leaves after a lot of evolution, it's because where does most CO2 come from? Decomposing soil organic matter. So it makes sense that it's coming up from the ground and going straight into the underside of a leaf, shortening that carbon cycle. Okay, so what else is it doing? It's creating liquid sugar, right? The carbohydrates, and you probably heard a lot about cakes and cookies and carbohydrates from last week's talk if you were there. And those sugar molecules flow throughout the plant. You know, they're building stems and roots and leaves, etc. But they're also doing something else, which leads to where does soil come from? Right? The old view was its decomposition and weathering, right? We're breaking down rocks, and they're, you know, it's by lichen and erosion, etc., that soil gets formed, and then decomposition of organic matter. So that's how it was believed, but really it's kind of the same process. It's part of photosynthesis. Remember those healthy sugars running throughout the plant, they actually come out through the roots, right? Plants, believe it or not, weren't here first. Microbes were here first. And every organism on the planet, including ourselves, are dependent on microbes. Without our microbiomes, we'd die. If the soil doesn't have any microbiome, it's very hard for a plant to survive. And so the plant needs its own microbiome, the soil has its own microbiome, everything's dependent on microbes. And so this great thing where the sugars come out of the roots, right? They're feeding those soil microbes. And some people call it the liquid carbon pathway, like Dr. Christine Jones. However you want to look at it, plants are exuding not just sugars, but other complex compounds. Sometimes it's lipids, amino acids, etc. Lots of different things are coming out of plant roots. And it's like, why would a plant give up some of its energy? Because it gets something in exchange. So it's getting minerals and water, and those microbes and mycorrhizal fungi, etc., are helping with that process. And that is key to everything. So we want this carbon-rich soil. We want it to work like a carbon sponge. And you can see it's holding together aggregates, right? This is critical stuff here. We want our aggregates held together. And it's the root exudates, glomalin, which is a really cool compound that mycorrhizal fungi produce. It's a what do they call it? A glycoprotein, but it's a really complex carbohydrate that helps build aggregates, and it's gluing together those sand, silt, and clay particles. And it's key for everything. So what we want to do in our ag lands is really maximize solar energy function. That sounds, it's like, what are you talking about? Solar energy function. We want as much photosynthesis to occur as possible. And there's a few ways that can happen, right? You could have more surface area of leaves, right? You definitely want to have as much of the ground covered as possible so that the sunlight is all being intercepted by leaves. But you can do that at multiple levels, right? You could have a high tree story and different under canopies all the way down to a low ground cover, and literally capture as much solar radiation as possible per square foot of land. And why do we want to maximize that? Because then we're going to maximize the amount of carbon that's going to flow into the soil to feed the soil microbes that do all the amazing things that soil microbes do. So this is all part of this regenerative concept, which is how do we maximize soil organic matter? And part of it has to do with making as much photosynthesis occur as possible. This is just a picture to show a pine sapling with mycorrhizal fungi on the right and without it. Which plant do you think is going to thrive faster? There have been lots of studies done with this, and mycorrhizal fungi are key, and they're missing from a lot of our ag soils and even our ranch lands and rangelands because they get so degraded and overgrazed. Here's another picture just to show you. We've got bad soil on the left, right? It's all dried out. We've got a net carbon loss, right? It's compacted, there's no organic matter, and on the right, and it's bare, right? On the right side, we've got plants photosynthesizing, right? They're pumping some of that carbon into the soil. Some of that carbon's coming back out of the soil, but it's going right back up into the underside of a leaf to get cycled back through again. So this is really key to understand, oh my gosh, plants versus bare soil. That's a huge difference. And here's another picture, right? So this was at an eco farm tour in California. These are literally like a mile apart from each other. And so in the wintertime, one farm, obviously they're growing annual crops there, but what they do in the winter, instead of having a cover crop, is they just get their fields ready for the spring and they leave them barren. And then when it rains, you get this runoff, right? So literally they had muddy water running off this farm. When it was raining, it had just stopped raining, but you can see that there were rivers of soil washing off of this land. Same day, I visited a vineyard and they're growing cover crops in between their vines. And there wasn't a drop of water that left this property, whereas the other property had a runoff issue. So it makes a huge difference as to how you treat your land. There's a bunch of really good demonstrations that you can learn to do yourself. I'd highly encourage you, if you want to learn how to talk about this stuff, this isn't a sales pitch, but we have a course where we teach all of this, how to be a better soil advocate. And we have all these examples, but you can Google any of these. The bread and flour demo is a great one. Picture just a couple pieces of bread and a pile of flour. You pour water on the bread, it soaks in. And when it spreads out, like once it's saturated, it leaks out the bottom, but it's clear. If you do that with flour, it doesn't soak in at all. It runs off and it carries flour with it. So the water's, dirty because it's filled with flour. So you've got low infiltration rates, high erosion. Super easy to demonstrate. Anyone gets it after that. And then they're like, well, why doesn't everybody do this? The slate test is another great test, water infiltration test. You can Google any one of those and see YouTube videos, and it really opens your eyes as to, oh my gosh, why is soil health so important? So let's talk about some of the principles of regenerative agriculture, because these are critical to understand. It's a principle. It doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly the same everywhere. It's just principles. So whoops, we lost one. Sorry. Can you see the word context, or is that cut off? It's at the very top.
Oh, we can see it, Don.
Okay.
Thank you.
So context is the first most important principle, which some people skip over, but it's really key. It has everything to do with where you're located, what your soil type is, what crops are you growing, what's your time frame, and what's your monetary situation. So you can't give certain solutions to some people because it's impossible. They couldn't afford what the solution is. But there are other solutions where you could give them that solution and be easy for them to do. So context is the first thing to understand. What's right for that particular landscape, for that particular farmer and his or her economic situation, right? There's so many things to think about. So context is the first important one to look at. Then we'll talk about actual practices on the ground, which the first one is least disturbance. And we don't mean, it doesn't have to be no-till, but tillage is generally degenerative in the grand sense. It's one of the most disruptive things we do is tillage. But minimal tillage or low-till, those are much better choices. No-till is extreme, and it's too prescriptive and too, like, you should never till your soil. There are certain situations where you're actually going to get the best result, the most regenerative result, by doing something. Maybe it's a one-time tillage event or a minimal tillage event where you can actually improve the whole system because you're doing that thing. So just all these things have, different scenarios where it's going to make a difference which you choose. Now, heavy chemical use, right? That's a disturbance. If we're talking fertilizers, right? NPK, that's a disturbance. So anything that's disturbing your soil is an issue, and we want to try and disturb it as little as possible. But some disturbance can be a really good thing. All right, living root. Now, of course, we want to have a living root in the ground as long as possible. I understand that in some places, I'm in California, it's like, what do you mean? You have a season where you can't grow anything? There's this thing called snow. I don't understand that one. But generally speaking, most people have a winter season and the ground might be covered with snow. But we want to have a living root in the ground as long as possible. Even once it's covered with snow, it might not be living, but it's food for microorganisms. So living root is critical to have one in the ground as often as possible. Soil armor, that just means we want to have the soil covered, preferably with a living plant, but sometimes you want it covered even if it's with a dead plant, right? So a lot of times we're going to do a cover crop, which is considered soil armor. It's also living root. And then if we're going to terminate that cover crop before we plant our cash crop, we're going to lay that down, hopefully, mowing, crimping, something other than an herbicide. And we're going to lay it down so that it's going to shield the soil. It's going to shade it. It's going to stop it from wind and rain erosion. And then plants can grow up through it. And it's going to be a food source for microbes as well, and keep the soil warmer at night and cooler during the day. So all sorts of benefits with soil armor. Then we've got animal integration. Now, I know some people are going to have issues with because they're vegan, et cetera. It's okay. Animals have been on this planet forever. We're an animal. We need to have animals on the planet. Our most fertile soils involve animal interactions. And that goes everywhere around the world where we had really fertile soils, there was animal integration, whether it was nature integrating it In our case now, since there's 8 billion of us, we need to manage that animal integration in a way that's beneficial. Most of our grazing techniques, or however, whether it's pigs or chickens, they're horrific, right? They're inhumane for the animal, the workers, and they're horrible environmentally. But if we think of things holistically and we have animals in for the right reasons at the right times and we treat them right, then magical stuff happens and we can rebuild soil rapidly. And you can do it without animals. It can happen faster with animals. And then we want to look at increasing biodiversity, right? This is another key. If you're just doing a big monocrop, you're doing a disservice to your land, right? You want to have as much species diversity as possible. Different plants produce different exudates, feed different soil biology. They provide habitat. So let's say that you're a farmer and you put in a strip that's just for beneficial insects or insects in general, or for habitat, or you're putting in owl boxes or bat boxes or whatever. Anything to improve the biodiversity of that landscape instead of, oh, you can't see a tree for miles. You should have a row of trees to act as windbreaks. They're also acting as shelter for all sorts of different species. The more diversity you have, the more insects you have, the more birds you'll have, and you just build these incredible systems that can regenerate themselves as you get that feedback loop going in the right way. Instead of a negative feedback loop, we start creating positive feedback loops. Now here's just a picture, and I know it's got lots of X's and check marks, but just to illustrate all the different principles, right? So we've got the degenerative CAFO, right? A confined animal feeding operation, right? Hopefully you're not buying your beef from some place like this. These cows, I mean, look what they're living in. Could you imagine working there? The smell, oh my gosh. So they're failing on all levels, right? Minimal disturbance, no living roots, no armored soil, no diversity. Oh, look, they've got animal integration. That is a fail. I'm sorry, that is not what we mean by animal integration. On the right side, we've got planned rotational grazing, right? So we put a lot of animals in a spot, but they're not there for very long, right? They're going to be there for a minimal amount of time. They're going to create the disturbance. A lot of that grass that you see is actually getting trampled. It's not even getting eaten. That's a good thing. That's going to be food for the soil microbes. It's also soil armor. And there's a living root going. You've got armored soil. You've got diversity, right? And a lot of these systems, when they move over from, let's say, set stock grazing, and they switch over to these systems, you put a lot of animals on for a short period of time, and then you let the land rest for a long period of time. This allows life to happen and flourish again. And then you come in, you impact it heavily for a short period of time, you let it recover. And pretty soon you have no more bare soil left, your animals are healthier, you've got greater biodiversity. People find the native seed bank that was there starts to sprout up again, and they're getting this diversity. So they might have only had, 5 or 10 species growing in their pastures, and all of a sudden there are 50 to 100 or 150 different species popping up. And they're like, we didn't plant this, how is this happening? And it's the power of planned grazing. Literally, you have to take a little more active role in it, but then you're increasing your carrying capacity of the land over time. You're using, less everything. The cows on the left, most likely they're getting antibiotics. Cows on the right, no need for antibiotics. I'm not saying never, I'm just saying generally speaking, they have a lot lower vet bills. And some of the farmers that practice this method don't have vet bills at all. They just refuse. If the cow can't make it, it's not fit for the herd. I know that sounds harsh, but keeps their costs down. So if all this stuff is so wonderful, why isn't everyone doing it, right? That's the question everybody's going to ask me, and I'll give a long answer in the Q&A. But in this regenerative model here, this is the same regenerative grazing, right? If you were to look at the neighbor's property, like across the driveway from here, their grass is literally 1 inch to 2 inches long. It's stubble. And they can't carry as many cows on their land. It's a fraction of the number of cows that you see in this picture. And so these guys have figured out that over time, they're able to increase the carrying capacity and the function of this land over time, and they're making more money while they're doing it. So it's literally more profitable. If you were, let's say you're not a rancher and you're doing this on your agricultural land, they're able to cut back so much. And this is from Gabe Brown and Ray Archuleta, who were featured in the film. Their business, Understanding Ag, now, they're now managing, they have over 32 million acres that they're consulting on. 32 million. That's a fraction of what we need, right? But that went from, a few 100,000 to 32 million in a short period of time. It's working, and what they're seeing on their ag land is that farmers that integrate regenerative principles, that understand how it works, they're able to save their farmers so that they're actually not losing money the first year. They're not going broke switching over. They're in fact saving money because they get them to they use science, right? And they get them to back off their input costs so much, because a lot of times the inputs, people they're sold their inputs, right? So the people selling them show them all the science as to how much they need. Well, that's not really the best person to be asking for how much do I need, right? So they're using science and saying, you can cut back on these input costs massively, maybe by 50% or more. And then they do, and they get these amazing results. They didn't spend the money on input costs, and then they're doing just as well at the end of that first year, which can be a real problem getting people to transition, because everyone's afraid they're going to go broke in the first year. So it can be a profitable model, and it actually is in the long run. It's definitely more profitable. So your input costs obviously go down dramatically. Like Dr. Alan Williams, where this picture is taken, he actually, when they first started, they had to bring bales of hay in because they didn't have enough forage for their animals. So at certain times of the year, they had to bring in forage. They don't bring in any forage anymore. The neighbors still have to bring in forage. They don't have bare soil anymore. They used to have bare soil. They get great water infiltration in the middle of the day. This is one of the really interesting things. When it's hot, cattle, when they only have 1 to 2 inches of stubble, the soil gets so hot, right? It might be 130, 140 degrees. The soil's so hot that it's too hot for the cow's nose. So rather than eat forage because it burned their nose, they will sit in the shade. On that same day in the summertime, Dr. Williams' cows will be out grazing at noon because it's only 80 degrees down where the cow's nose is, because there's dense forage. Huge difference. So his cows are packing on pounds and the neighbor's cows are not. A really different economic model. So let's talk about plant health, right? So conventional ag, we're putting antibiotics out on the soil. I mean, look at this guy's wearing a mask. No farmer enjoys that part. They're not like, oh, I get to go spray toxic chemicals today. Oh, I get to go spray herbicide today. It's not necessarily something they want to do, but it's what they've been taught. And antibiotics will not be regenerative, right? We want to be putting out probiotics. We want to be doing things that are beneficial for the soil microbiome. And that is, it could be compost, but it could be a host of other things. It could just be a cover crop, right? It could be putting less on, right? The lesson is to put less on and not be a more on person, right? Get it? More on, more on. All right, I can't hear your laughter, but I'm assuming somebody might have smiled. Okay. Plants What's the immune system, right? Anyone go to a community garden and one plot, their plants are really healthy and the other plot has powdery mildew or aphids or whatever. And it's just different management systems, right? Plants have an immune system, right? They depend on their soil microbiome and their internal microbiome to stay healthy. When a plant is truly healthy, it's resistant to bugs and disease, just like humans, right? So plants have an immune system. We need to help create those or create the conditions so that their immune systems are thriving, right? So putting on antibiotics, is that a good way to boost your immune system? No. Putting on probiotics, different story, right? And your tongue knows the difference, right? If you go to a farmer's market and you taste that tomato, odds are it's going to taste a lot better than the store-bought tomato, right? And it was grown in better soil. This is Dan Kittredge's work. I don't know if he's going to be on your show at any point in time, but the Bionutrient Food Association, they're working on a handheld device to basically show nutrient density, super cool. But some of their preliminary results, 200 carrots grown on one farm would equal 1 carrot grown on another farm, right? That's an extreme, right? Those are outliers, but literally 1 carrot had so many more polyphenols than the other carrot that it would take 200 of the other carrot to equal 1 of these carrots. That's a big deal. So there's significant variations in our food. A carrot is not a carrot, right? It depends on how it was grown. And they found the same to be true in spinach. In this case, 14 spinach leaves equals 1 spinach leaf. But huge differences in all sorts. I mean, they were finding huge differences across the spectrum because nobody really has measured all these trace elements and phytochemicals, et cetera. So that's what he's working on, is building this database. But it's really fascinating research. And if you want to dig into that, definitely check out the Bionutrient Food Association. And they are on the East Coast. And as you know from last week, right, microbes rule this world, right? We've got a healthy soil microbiome. You need that to get your healthy plants and animals. Since we're eating plants and animals, or plants and or animals, that's what we need in order for us to be healthy. Hopefully, if we're healthy, we'll be making wiser decisions, right? And we'll actually have a healthy planet because we need a healthy planet. Water cycle, got to talk about that. Let me just check my time. Huge importance, right? Regenerative ag, we're going to be improving how water flows across our landscape. The small water cycle, not oftenly talked about, but 40% of our rain or moisture comes from this cycle. It's not coming from the oceans, right? It's from local evaporation and transpiration. So the new water paradigm, you can check out their work. They've got tons of great research on this. This is just our current situation, right? What do? We cut down our forests in the mountains, which causes runoff, water erosion, et cetera. We overgraze, we till, we use chemicals, right? It's all degenerative agriculture. We build a big city and we've got heat coming off both the land and the city. And then we've got water, we've got pollution going in. We've lost our springs and our aquifers are empty, right? That's what we're doing. And if you look up here, you've got the large water cycle and it dissipates because of the radiant heat that's coming off here. And then it just bypasses the city, right? Not a good cycle. This is what we're shooting for, right? We have a green city and we're practicing regenerative farming, and we don't clear cut our forests, and we've got our aquifers full, we've got springs coming back, and we don't have pollution, and everybody's happy, right? That's what it could look like this, right? It's not rocket science. It's just paying attention. And once again, this is just a picture, like, look at the difference, right? When you have barren soil, it gets hot. And all that heat, we're talking about changing not just local climate. This is a macro climate. Look at the hills in the distance. This whole area is generating massive heat and there's no clouds coming. if we could only figure out a way to get that covered to look like this, that would change dramatically. So what we want to do is reverse desertification. And yes, it can be done. It takes some time and planning, but it can be done. All right. Okay. So can it scale? And I'm gonna try and go fast here because I don't want to run out of time. But Rajendra Singh, Dr. Rajendra Singh, the waterman of India, he's done this across millions of acres and changed the local temperature by 2 degrees C. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. Jonathan Liu's work, he didn't do it, but the documentaries are out there about the lowest plateau. As I mentioned earlier, that's the size of Belgium. Tony Ronaldo's work in sub-Saharan Africa, you can read about him. There's a great podcast with him, Neil Spackman and Raleigh Latham, and they talk about his work, and you can literally see the images from satellite over what happened over 25 years and the regeneration that took place, staggering. And that didn't cost money. That was education-based, local people doing it. So this can work. It's been shown to work at scale, so it can work pretty much anywhere. So Kiss the Ground right now, we're working, our latest project since the movie is called Regenerate America, and we're literally working on the Farm Bill, the 23 Farm Bill and beyond. So we went from this little group in a living room in Venice, California, to being in front of the House Agriculture Committee. Not bad for 9 years worth of work. So the Farm Bill, it's got 1% to rebuild soil, and we're trying to get that up to 3 to 5% towards rebuilding soil. So we're really trying to get some government funding and acknowledgement about the importance of healthy soil. So a new view, we can do this. We can, the solutions are known. It's not new science, right? Indigenous people have been doing this for millennia, but all their knowledge we said, oh, they don't know what they're doing, they're primitive. But their knowledge coupled with today's latest research, these solutions work. It's not rocket science. It's been proven to work everywhere in every climate. So really fascinating. If you need some reading, highly recommend Entangled Life. It's a fungi book, but it's really great. I Contain Multitudes, another great book. What Your Food Ate, great book. Regeneration by Paul Hawken, another great book. I can give those to you later if you didn't catch all those. And then you have to ask yourself, how does the food you eat affect the environment around you, right? If you ask that question, it'll lead you to some deeper thoughts. What can you do? Grow your own food, pay attention to what you buy, get to know a farmer or several, support your local farmers market, compost, learn more about Regen Ag, and hopefully you'll be a healthy soil advocate, because we need as many of you as possible. And my favorite, the Lorax by Dr. Seuss, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. All right, I think I made it. Whew, I had 3 minutes to spare.
Oh, we could just talk about soils forever, couldn't we? It's such a deep topic in so many ways. Well, thank you so much, Don. This is amazing. Before we jump into the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone that the next webinar we are hosting is on January 3rd, so the first Tuesday in January. And the speaker will be Matt Powers, also known as the permaculture student, and he's going to speak about regenerative soil, the key to healthy, resilient, and nutritionally dense plants. So that sounds like it'll be a wonderful follow-up to a lot of what you talked about tonight.
Yeah, Matt's awesome.
All right, so let's dive right into those questions. Got some great ones here.
Do you want me to look at the Q&A, or are you gonna do them, or how's that gonna work?
Oh, we can just throw the questions at you one at a time if you'd like.
Sure. Should I stop my share? Is that better?
Yeah, that would be great, thanks.
Okay. All
right, so the first question, this came in pretty early on in your talk, and I think you covered this a little bit, but maybe elaborate a bit more. The question is regenerative agriculture like no-till agriculture, or is it more?
It's more. So there's so many different names out there, and everyone wants to get their name recognized. You can call it agroecology, right? That's recognized by the United Nations. Is regenerative agriculture agroecology? Yep. Is agroecology regenerative agriculture? Yes. And they're looking at, I mean, it goes way beyond just the agricultural part. I mean, it starts to look at the humans involved, right? The communities involved. And that's a really important part to think about as well, is how does this impact the local community? Can you bring jobs back to a neighborhood, et cetera? But everything, there's so many different names. Like, okay, no, I'm into biointensive. No, I'm biodynamic. Oh, I'm organic. Oh, I'm conventional. Can you be regenerative conventional? Yes. Can you be degenerative conventional? Yes. So really, there could be a degenerative organic farmer. So just because you say I'm organic, you might not be paying attention to your soil health, and you can be losing carbon from your soil, even though you're organic. And there's, you know, nowadays, I'm sure some of you have heard of the Real Organic Project, but, you know, hydroponics is now allowed in organics. There's all sorts of issues where organic doesn't necessarily mean healthy soil. So it used to, once upon a time, when it was first started, it was all about soil health, and then it kind of morphed away from that. So don't get too caught up in the names. Just know that something is regenerative if it's increasing the carrying capacity of that land. Are you storing more carbon in your soil? Are you able to hold more water? Are you increasing biodiversity? These are things that are regenerative. So just one prescription like, oh, I'm no-till. No-till, you could be no-till and degenerative. So there's so many different ways to do it, because some people are no-till and they're spraying glyphosate, right? So they're spraying their herbicide. It's like, oh no, I plant a cover crop and then I kill it with an herbicide, and then I plant my crop. If any weeds come up, I nuke them again. Well, you might be no-till, but you're not making the environment better, right? You're not improving your biodiversity. Your soil microbes are unhappy. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a thorough answer. Appreciate it. So the next question, does carbon sequestration occur in tree canopies or in soil?
Well, both. If ideal, what you want, like anything that goes into a plant that's above ground, well, you could say that about the roots too. You are sequestering carbon, but that's going to be a short term. Even if the tree lives for 1,000 years, it's okay, you sequestered carbon, but at some point that tree is going to die and decompose, and that's when the carbon is going to get released back to the atmosphere. But it is definitely sequestering carbon. So that's good, but what you really want is to get it into the soil in a long-term form. So I don't want to get too often into the weeds about, the occluded light fraction versus the heavy fraction versus the labile carbon, but labile carbon is that carbon that's cycling rapidly, right? It's not going to hang out in the soil for a long time. That's not a bad thing, right? You need that because you want your plants. The limiting factor for most plants is CO2. That sounds funny, but plants can't grow without carbon dioxide, right? So we should be happy that it's so high at 400 parts per million, but that's causing another problem. And I know it's closer to 420 parts per million, but just as an idea, when a plant opens its stomata, that means that when it takes in one sip of air, it's got to do that like 2,500 times to get that one piece of CO2, because we're at 400 parts per million. I'm doing simple math for you, but one piece out of 2,500, only one particle of air in 2,500 particles is CO2. So it is hard for them to capture those carbon molecules. But if it's coming out of the ground because you have a high soil organic matter content, like let's say that you went from a 1% situation to a 5% situation. So you've got 5 times more CO2 that's coming back out of the soil to get sucked right back into a plant. That makes a huge difference in how fast that plant can grow. And the healthier that plant is, right? Think of a big leaf versus a sick plant that has a small, thin leaf. It's not photosynthesizing efficiently. So even though it's photosynthesizing, the bigger, healthier, thicker leaf, it's going to photosynthesize more efficiently. And John Kemp has a whole bunch of stuff about where he talks about that efficiency of photosynthesis being key. I'm getting off the subject, but yeah, basically you want to get, you're going to capture carbon in both the canopy, the roots, and the soil, right? We want it to go into the soil.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, it's all about the carbon. And by the way, photosynthesis is my new favorite word. I plan on using that a lot.
Excellent.
So the next question is, what do you think of co-joining regenerative agriculture sites with renewable energy, for example, solar sites? Is that possible?
Yeah, there's people doing it. It's called agrivoltaics. So Google, it's AGRI, voltaics, like photovoltaics. Google agrivoltaics, and you'll find all kinds of people that are studying this very thing. One of the nice things about it is that, one, you're able to grow stuff underneath, and if it's covered, the problem with a lot of solar installations is dust. And it sounds kind of funny, but they'll have these barren landscapes underneath them, and they're capturing power, but when you get dust on a solar panel, it's not efficient. So one of the ways to keep it clean is to make sure that ground is covered in some way. So if you can grow something and graze underneath it, or even get a yield off something, that's really can be beneficial. Once again, context is going to be really important. It's a lot harder to do that out in the desert where a lot of these solar installations are. But there are people that are definitely trading, doing both. So they're getting solar on their land and still being able to grow.
That's cool. I appreciate that. A lot of mix of use of landscapes there. Next question, when do you know when to use probiotics, and is there such thing as too much probiotics to use? I'm sorry, yeah, probiotics.
Once again, the context would make a big difference. Like anything, too much of something, like let's say, oh yeah, I'm going to put 5,000 tons per acre of compost out. Well, I don't know, that might be excessive. You might get incredible results, but it depends. But generally speaking, there's not enough food for the microbes because there's only 1% soil organic matter. So jump-starting the system, this is where doing it the right way, if you can jumpstart that system, you can literally all of a sudden you kickstart it by putting out, let's say, some extra carbon source. It could be compost. It could be as simple as sugar. Literally, people are out there spraying sugar and minerals out on their property. It's super inexpensive. And they're seeing this burst of biology. And when that burst happens in the soil, you get a bunch of microbes, which is food for a whole bunch of other things. And all of a sudden you jumpstart nutrient cycling, your plants do better. And then they photosynthesize better. They start exuding more exudates into the soil, and you get that positive feedback loop. And it's just, people they're always amazed at how fast these systems can recover. And it's just like, you just need to jumpstart it, right? A little jump, and then all of a sudden you get into a positive feedback loop.
It's all about keeping the microbes happy, isn't it?
Yeah. And I'm sure there's a limit to how much probiotics, but generally just put some out and don't go excessive, because they usually cost money. So.
Okay, now we have a couple of pretty similar questions asking, what can a home gardener do to help protect and improve soil health?
Pretty much the same principles that we're talking about on large scale ag. So you want to keep your soil protected. You want to make sure that you've got a living root there. If you have animal integration, you might have just a little chicken or one duck or whatever. It just depends. For a lot of homeowners, having a cow around doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's not the right context, right? So animal integration might not apply to you, but minimizing your tillage could be great. Plant more perennials. Look to permaculture, which if I'm going to talk about permaculture, I have to say, this is indigenous knowledge. Permaculture is not new, right? It's based on indigenous wisdom, right? They looked at all these different cultures and figured out, how did these people manage to live within their bioregion? it's great. The principles are sound. They're not new. So just give the indigenous people so much credit because they thought 7 generations out or more. And, you know, here I'm worried about next week. But literally, you can do a whole bunch of things. I personally think like a great introductory book would be Gaia's Garden by Toby Hemingway. That's a classic permaculture book, really good to make you think a little bit differently and just get a small grasp about permaculture and what the concepts are behind that.
All right, thank you. The next question asks, I've seen different figures for numbers of earthworms as an indicator of soil health. For the home gardener, what is a good number of worms per cubic foot of soil?
Oh, I love it. They put in per cubic foot because I was going to ask, how deep are we talking?
You got the specifics you need.
Yeah. I will say it depends because it's a biological system. I don't know what type of earthworms would be prevalent in your neck of the woods. So if you don't have 25, you should be embarrassed. I'm just kidding. But literally, like, there's so many different numbers out there, and every situation is going to be different because of your soil type and what type of ground cover you have and what kind of plants you have. If you have earthworms, you're definitely doing well. Some places, you know, the earthworms that are there are actually detrimental. Might be invasive earthworm. So it's really hard to know. And so I can't give you, like, who can honestly give you the right answer, right? Like, seriously, like, there's a right answer. I don't know. When I used to have a worm bin, like a 4 foot by 8 foot by, 18 inches deep worm bin, not your average worm bin, that I maintained at a school. And you would want to have at least 2 pounds per square foot of earthworms. Like, that's a good number. Now, do you want that in your soil? No way. That is way too many earthworms. But you can have a massive amount. I mean, when I lifted my worm bin, it made noise. It sounded like Rice Krispies. There were so many worms in my worm bin. It was crazy. You want to see worms, if possible, if worms live in your neighborhood. Some soils, some places, earthworms are not native, but generally speaking, you want to have some. More is better.
That was a good way to wriggle out of that question.
Nice.
Right. And actually, just as a follow-up to that, all of the worms in our area are non-native because this part of the world was glaciated in the most recent ice age. And so all of the worms we have here have come in here since European colonization. There weren't worms here prior to that. And so they have created some issues in Northeast forests by recycling the litter layer too quickly.
Right.
So
and then
as
you're left with bare soil and bad things happen.
Yeah, exactly. So that can be kind of a challenge for people. And actually, just kind of a follow-up question to that, I wonder if would it be possible to answer that question sort of qualitatively instead of quantitatively. So instead of number of earthworms per cubic foot of soil, like, what's the soil texture that you're aiming for? And if you have that, do you know you have enough earthworms? Is that maybe another way to approach that?
Yeah, I mean, you could look at what's your percentage of soil organic matter? How's your soil aggregation? How fast can you infiltrate water? Right? That's, like, to me, that's really important, is looking at your aggregation. If you have really good soil aggregation, maybe you just need gophers, right? I mean, it just depends, right? So it is hard to know, and what is your soil type, right? And where you fit in that sand, silt, and clay matrix, right? So if you've got a nice loam and you only have 3 earthworms, but your plants are thriving, well, then who am I to say, oh, you don't have 25? Oh my gosh, you're a failure. So, it's going to vary all over the map, but really look at your aggregation and your infiltration rates. Infiltration rates are really easy to do. I mean, you can Google that as well, but it's really informative. Like, does water soak in when it rains, or does it run off? And if you have runoff, if it's not soaking in, you've got poor infiltration.
Although I do see this as a great opportunity for people to take some interest in counting worms, which I think sounds like a really, really fun pastime.
Yeah, just don't do it everywhere because that's a lot of disturbance, right?
Yes, yeah. So there's a question that's a follow-up to what we were talking about before on the probiotics question. So they're asking, can you give examples of inputs that are classified as probiotics? Are these manure, compost, humates, rock dust, etc.?
Yes. Basically all kinds of organic inputs could be considered probiotics, but I have to be careful with that because an organic input could be copper sulfate, which is a legal pesticide, right? Which is an antibiotic. So let's just say, yes, rock dust could be considered that. Kelp could be considered that, right? Lots of things that aren't man-made chemicals would be considered probiotics, so human manure could be considered a probiotic. There's lots of different things that you could consider probiotics. I'm not quite sure what your question's stemming from, but maybe it's because I didn't explain probiotic, but anything that's going to improve your soil health or your plant health, right? So usually that's some type of application to the soil. Now there's certain ones like raw manure is not optimal, right? It should, ideally it's composted first because raw manure can cause certain issues. So if it's composted first, that's great. But now we're talking about compost. But bone meal, blood meal, right? These are all things that would be considered organic things that are going to have some positive impact compared to, say, spraying a herbicide or some type of pesticide. Those are generally negative. Or even a nitrogen fertilizer, like you could be putting out some type of high-end fertilizer, and that excess N is literally killing your soil biology. And some of it is off-gassing in the form of nitrous oxide, which is also a potent greenhouse gas. So even though you think you're doing, well, I'm putting nitrogen out there, what's in the wrong form, right? So you have to pay attention to what you're doing and really understand, is this a probiotic? Is this going to get me more life or is it detrimental? And you have to look at all the life forms that it's impacting. So some people would look at neem oil, right, which is a broad spectrum pesticide, but it's organic. But you could be killing a whole bunch of beneficial insects. And I wouldn't call that a probiotic, but it's an organic input that people would, some people swear by it because it gets rid of their pests, but it's also getting rid of a whole bunch of beneficial insects. So I don't view that as a probiotic. So it's just, is it pro-life or not? That's what probiotic means, right? Pro-life, and antibiotic is against life, anti-life, right? So that's what I meant by a probiotic, pro-life. Cool. Well, that has other connotations, but anyway.
Seems to fall into the get to know your local farmer category too, to understand what's right for you in your area and your crops.
Right.
Cool. Okay. The next question comes in the context of prairie plants. Aren't the third of a plant's roots that die each year most important to carbon sequestration? So are the third of a plant's roots that die each year the most important to carbon sequestration?
Wow, the most important. Whenever someone says most, I don't know. They're not the most. They're important. How can you determine which one's more important? I don't know, because I don't know that the research has ever been done to say that this is the most important. It's all important. So if you're talking about prairie grasses and wintertime comes along and they get grazed and they're going to slough off some of their roots, etc. Is that important? Yes. How that carbon from that root gets diverted into, is it going to go into the label pool, the light fraction, or the heavy fraction, right? Is it going to be around for thousands of years? We're not really clear. It depends which microbes grab hold of it and how those microbes, what eats those microbes, and how does it get broken down? It is important. I can say that, but I can't say what's the most important part. It's all, anything that adds to soil organic matter is a good thing. So a root in the soil is a good thing, because at some point it's going to die, and that's going to create, it's going to be food. And when it's living, it's pumping exudates out. When it dies, it's going to become food and create pathways, because as it gets eaten, now you've got a pathway for both air and water exchange, which are really important.
So the next question, it's a pretty straightforward question of what else can I do to improve my overall soil health, but there's a lot of context here as well. So because we know that you would ask those questions. So this is someone who has a farm but no livestock. They do hay the fields and have horses on a small section. And there's a section of the field that they're letting grow back to support wildlife. They brush hog once a year after the temperatures have reached 50 degrees for at least 7 days to allow for beneficial insects to emerge, but before the migratory ground nesting birds show up. They don't use herbicides or pesticides. And so it sounds like this is someone who's already doing a lot of the right things. And the question is just, what else can I do to improve the overall soil health?
That would be hard. Like, where are they exactly? And when they say I hay, what is, I need more context, as I understand you're growing hay, but how many different species are you growing? Right? Is it diverse? And it says you have horses, but you're not using those horses across the landscape. They're just kept in one little small section, which is probably overgrazed, right? So could you, and I have no idea how many acres we're talking about, but could you consider moving those animals across your landscape and try and do some type of adaptive multi-paddock grazing system? I don't know. I mean, I have no idea.
This is actually a farm that I'm familiar with. It's right here in the Millbrook area near our office, and it's a little over 100 acres in total, with a lot of it in open fields, a small area of which is a paddock for the horses.
Yeah, so I don't know, like what would you say the biodiversity is there?
Oh, that I could not say. So you're talking about the diversity of plants in the hayfield?
Yeah, and then do they have trees? Like, are the paddocks separated by trees? Are there different, like when you say fields, is it like a silvopasture arrangement, or is it just big open fields with fence lines?
Right, it's mostly open fields, and I know part of it is being left to just be wildlife habitat. That's the part that's being brush hogged once a year. It's surrounded by woods, but there's not really woods within the field. There's, I think, a hedgerow or two. But the trees are mostly lining the edges of the fields, and the forest is beyond that.
Yeah. Well, generally speaking, without knowing exactly the scale, having more diversity at multiple heights, because when you have, if it's just a field, that's not really good habitat. I mean, it's habitat for certain things, but you're not getting the diversity. So like permaculture, one of the things they talk about is edges, right? Increasing your edge. So what can you do to increase edge? Well, if you plant rows of trees, you're increasing edges. If you're doing things on contour, like, I don't know what the slope is this perfectly flat land? Do you have any water? Do you have any soil erosion issues? So there's so many questions without seeing it. Like, it's really hard for me to give any prescriptive advice. And once again, I'm not native to that area, so I really don't know. Like, what's the wildlife there? Is it just deer?
There's definitely a lot of deer, and they're very heavily impact the landscape. We do have a pretty healthy population of what we would call charismatic macrofauna, like bobcats and bears and wild turkeys and so forth.
Cool.
And this particular area is somewhat sloped. There is some streams and a little pond. But kind of getting back to your biodiversity question, that's a really interesting thing for people to dive more deeply into. And can you suggest any resources where people might be able to find, a species list of something they might want to seed their hay pasture with?
Yeah, I would talk to probably your native plant people out in that neck of the woods, because they'd have probably a decent palette to choose from. And then, if you're trying to build some diversity, like if you follow, say, restoration agriculture principles, they'd look at, well, what's native and what's native, or what's closest to those species that actually produces food, right? And then do I want to integrate something that's going to produce food for myself or that I could sell? I mean, once again, I don't know their context. Like, oh, we want to have the best soil possible. Well, okay, is that your only context? Like, do you want the land to produce some value besides just, oh no, it's just for nature. We want it there for nature, which is great. Like it sounds like you're very conscientious, trying to do the best thing possible, but without knowing like all the context to try and get different ideas. I mean, I'm just like throwing stuff out, but I have no idea what's pertinent. So.
And someone has also typed in a follow-up to this particular question, suggesting that we read Doug Tallamy's book called The Life of Oaks, which I know focuses a lot on the biodiversity that's supported by the oak genus in particular. So thank you for that suggestion. That book is on my stack. I haven't read it yet, but.
There's so many books out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find that with questions like these and all the inputs, it's like hard to think if you're doing the best, but if you're doing what you can, you're doing what you can. The best might be unattainable.
You're doing better than people that aren't listening to this talk, right?
Sure.
Most of the people that tune into something like this, they're already trying to do the right thing. But I really can't give that kind of prescriptive advice without, I don't have the knowledge for that particular area.
Sure. Well, thank you. Another question coming in about native plants. Do native plants help with soil regeneration, or does it not matter if they are native?
Well, I think any living plant can help. Native plants it's a slippery slope, because how far back in time do you want to go to say what's native, right? So what's native to the East Coast was a lot of chestnut trees. No, sorry, what was the big tree that you had out there? Was it chestnut?
Yeah,
the chestnut blight. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, they've all been dead for a long time, but the chestnuts are still here. They just don't get very big anymore.
Right, but so it's like, okay, well, and I know they're trying to bring them back, et cetera, but it's a long process. But it's really challenging. I just think that anything living is better than nothing, right? I know you might not say that about poison ivy or something, but generally speaking, you want to have as many living things as possible at as many different levels. So you really want to think about that overstory. What's my overstory? And then everything that's going to be all the different layers in the understory, and what vines can you have creeping up, and what fungi are you going to be growing? And can I get to greater perennial usage? Because a lot of times we get down to just annuals, and sometimes we could be growing the same crop, but it could be a perennial where you're not having to disturb the soil each year. So that's something to think about. But every situation's unique, and I don't think I can answer that question as to which is, I don't know, thoughtful planning. I would say native, but once again, how far back in time are you looking to see what is native? Do you go back 10,000 years to pre-ice age, post-ice age? Because what was native, like maybe that came over, 5,000 years ago, and it's an invasive, but you think it's native. And does it really matter? If the soil's not bare, great, right? That's what I'm a fan of. Don't have bare soil.
Yeah, the classification can be really difficult, and there's a lot of terms that are kind of gray areas for the most part. But I think getting to the functionality of it is probably the best way to answer that question. And there is a follow-up comment just pointing out that native plants tend to have greater root depths, which would certainly be good for stabilizing the soil. So the last question has to do with alpaca manure. I'm excited about this one. Can alpaca manure be applied without composting? This person has read that it will not burn the plants. And they're also wondering, are there other benefits to composting, like nitrogen availability, for example?
Wow, I don't know enough about alpaca manure. I can say that, you know, we're the only species on the planet that figured out we need to use potable water to go to the bathroom and move it in pipes long distances. Everybody else on the planet just seems to poop in place, and it's not so bad. But I wouldn't be too concerned, because alpacas poop in the wild and nature seemed to survive. So I wouldn't be too worried about it. I'm talking about like really condensed cow manure that might be coming from a dairy operation or something like that, where it's kind of anaerobic and it's not just a cow pie out in the field. So don't know enough about alpaca. Let's see, it will not burn plants. Are there other benefits to composting? Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things about composting is you're breaking down the organic matter into unrecognizable pieces. And probably Jeff talked a lot about compost. I didn't really come prepared with a compost talk, but I've been an avid composter. And you're getting not only the biology, but also the minerals more plant available. Nitrogen typically is not, it's not a high nitrogen thing, because you're usually looking at a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Compost is not generally thought of as a, well, it can't be called a fertilizer because the mineral content varies so much. And in order to be a fertilizer, you have to be exactly on these numbers, like, oh, you're a 3-2-2. Well, you have to be consistent. I've never met a compost that was consistent, because the feedstocks are all over the map, right? So you never know. But typically your nitrogen is going to be used up. It's not going to be, there will be some, but it's not going to be a lot of your compost. So I think it's more nutrient available more so than nitrogen availability. That's how I would answer that.
All right, thank you, Don. And we're almost at 7:30, but we have one more question. If you're feeling like you haven't answered enough, you've burned through about 20 of them, so you're doing great. So it's just, when you say leave no bare ground, do you consider grass to be as good as multi-leaved plants?
That's, once again, it depends how tall is your grass, right? Like, if your grass is a grass that grows 6 feet tall or 10 feet tall, that's awesome. But what if your grass is only growing 1 inch tall, right? How much carbon can it sequester? I'm still going to take the 1 inch tall grass over bare soil, right? But there's so many variations in grass. But I think a multi-leaf plant, it just depends. Who's going to get more carbon into the soil? And every plant does it differently at different times throughout its life. So plants are always doing some amount, well, not always, but their exudation level varies depending on time of year, health of plant, species of plant, weather, all sorts of things. And I don't even think the science has been done to measure every single variable on every single plant as to what's optimal. So just keep your soil covered. Like, even if mulch is your solution, mulch is still better than bare soil. But I would much rather having a living plant of some type. Grass could be fine. Grass could be fine. I just don't know what's your goal? Once again, what are you trying to maximize? The amount of carbon in your soil? Then you have to figure out what, and I don't even know where you can find that research. No, I'm going to grow this crop because this is going to sequester, 1 milligram more carbon than this one. I don't know. It's a tough one.
It is. If there's one thing I've learned about ecology education, is that it's that the answer is always the same. It depends.
It depends, right.
Yeah,
it depends answer.
Systems are so complex, so there's always context that's needed. So it looks like we've got through all of our questions, and I just want to thank you so much, Don, for a wonderful presentation and for answering all these great questions. I know I learned a lot tonight, and I think everybody else did as well. So with that, we will wrap up and say good night to everyone, and thanks again, Don. We really appreciate your time.
All right, well, thank you very much. Have a great night.
Thank you very much, you too. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Don. We appreciate it. And thank you everyone for attending. Good night.